The storm rolled in faster than I expected, its gray tendrils wrapping around the house like a suffocating fog. Thunder grumbled low and constant, a restless sound that seemed to rattle the very bones of the old place. Rain lashed against the windows, relentless in its attack, as though the sky itself sought entry. Trapped indoors, I wandered aimlessly through the creaking halls of my family home, a house far older than anyone could trace, a relic steeped in shadows and whispered stories. The attic had always been off-limits when I was a child. My parents said it was unsafe, full of splintered wood and precarious stacks of forgotten memories. But now, with no one left to enforce the rules, curiosity pulled me up the narrow staircase, its groaning steps protesting every move I made. The door was heavier than I remembered, and it opened with a shuddering sigh, revealing a room cloaked in dust and gloom. The air smelled stale, thick with the scent of old paper and wood left to rot. Light from the single bulb barely reached the far corners, leaving the space unevenly illuminated. Boxes piled high threatened to topple, their sides split open to reveal yellowed documents, cracked leather bindings, and tarnished trinkets. My fingers brushed across a stack of faded photographs, their edges curling with age. Faces stared back at me, unfamiliar people locked in timeless expressions. And then I saw it. The camera sat on a shelf near the window, its presence commanding yet unobtrusive, like it had always been there waiting. The body was made of black leather and brass, its accordion lens extended slightly as though caught mid-breath. The case was scratched but intact, its latch tarnished yet still functional. I picked it up carefully, surprised by its weight. Despite the dust covering its surface, the camera felt warm to the touch, a sensation that should have been impossible in the cold attic. A note was tucked beneath it, scrawled in an elegant yet hurried hand. For the one who dares to see beyond the veil. The words sent a shiver down my spine, though I tried to brush it off as a melodramatic memento left by one of my ancestors. Testing the camera seemed harmless enough, a distraction from the storm outside. I brought it downstairs, wiping the lens with the corner of my shirt before adjusting the tripod I'd found alongside it. There was no film in the case, but I wasn't ready to give up. To my surprise, an old drawer in the study yielded a small tin of undeveloped plates, perfectly sized for the antique device. A strange thrill ran through me as I loaded the first one. I turned the camera toward the living room, its brass frame gleaming faintly under the warm lamplight. The storm's howling seemed distant now, muffled as I peered through the viewfinder. The world on the other side of the lens appeared slightly distorted, edges blurred in a way that made it seem ethereal. I snapped the shot. What I saw when the photograph began to develop that evening would follow me for the rest of my life. The process was slower than I expected, but it allowed the anticipation to build, tightening like a coil in my chest. The darkroom was improvised, an unused pantry with just enough space for a red bulb and a set of trays. The chemical smell was sharp, filling the air with a sterile tang as I carefully dipped the glass plate into the developer. My breath misted against the dim light, my heart racing in a way I couldn't explain. Slowly, the image began to emerge. At first, it was just the faint outlines of the living room, the threadbare rug, the overstuffed armchair, and the low table cluttered with books and stray coasters. But then, as the picture clarified, I saw them. Two figures stood in the background, vague, almost translucent shapes at first glance, but unmistakably human. They were positioned near the fireplace, which hadn't been lit in years. One was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a suit from another era. The other was smaller, delicate, clad in what might have been a dress, though the details were indistinct. Both were smiling. Their faces sent a chill rippling through me. It wasn't their presence, unnerving though it was, that made my stomach drop. It was the nature of their smiles. They were too wide, too precise, as though someone had stretched their mouths to fit a mold. And their eyes, though faint in the photograph, seemed fixed on me. I stared at the image for what felt like an eternity, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Dust on the lens? A trick of the light? Perhaps there had been an old portrait hanging by the fireplace that I'd simply forgotten about. But deep down, I knew these explanations didn't hold. Determined to dispel my growing unease, I carried the camera back to the living room and set it up in a different position. This time, I aimed it at the front door and snapped another photo, confident that I'd prove myself wrong. Yet as I developed the second plate, the feeling of dread only deepened. The figures were there again, closer this time. Their positions had shifted slightly, as though they were moving toward the camera. The man's head tilted slightly, his unnerving smile widening. The woman's hand was now raised in a half-wave, her fingers bent unnaturally at the knuckles. I dropped the plate, the glass shattering on the floor. My heart thundered in my chest as I stumbled out of the pantry, slamming the door shut behind me. The house, though silent, no longer felt empty. It felt observed. I told myself I wouldn't touch the camera again. But that night, I dreamt of smiling faces, their eyes following me through the shadows. Morning brought no relief. Though sunlight spilled weakly through the windows, it seemed to fall short of dispelling the oppressive unease lingering in the house. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every gust of wind rattling the panes set my nerves on edge. The photographs I developed lay face down on the kitchen counter, their fragile glass plates wrapped hastily in paper towels. I couldn't bring myself to look at them again, not after the restless night I'd spent dreaming of hollow grins and watchful eyes. I busied myself with menial tasks, cleaning dishes, rearranging bookshelves, anything to distract from the camera sitting in the corner of the living room. Its silent presence was unbearable, as if it were waiting for me to pick it up again. By early afternoon, I found myself drawn back to the attic, searching for clues among the piles of forgotten belongings. The attic was colder than before, and the storm had left a faint dampness in the air. As I sifted through boxes, my hands brushed against brittle papers and musty fabrics. Then, tucked beneath a stack of old letters tied with string, I found it. A leather-bound journal, its edges cracked and worn. The name inscribed on the cover, Margaret Halcroft, stirred faint memories of stories my grandmother had told me about a reclusive great-aunt. She'd been an eccentric, obsessed with spiritualism and photography, spending her later years capturing what she believed were glimpses of the afterlife. The journal was filled with scrawled notes and sketches detailing Margaret's experiments with the camera. Her words revealed a growing obsession, an insistence that the camera didn't just capture images, but glimpses of a hidden world. She described shadowy figures that appeared in her photographs, always smiling, always watching. The entries grew more erratic as the pages went on, her handwriting devolving into frantic scribbles. One phrase repeated over and over in the final pages sent chills racing up my spine. They see me now. They are coming closer. My breath hitched as a realization struck. The camera hadn't just been a curiosity. It was a door, and I'd opened it. That evening, the storm returned. Rain lashed against the windows as the wind howled through the eaves. The house seemed to shift and groan under the weight of the tempest, every sound amplified by my growing paranoia. Despite my fear, I couldn't resist the pull of the camera. It sat on the tripod, a silent sentinel in the corner, daring me to try again. I loaded another plate, my hands trembling as I turned the lens toward the staircase. The house seemed unnaturally still, as though it, too, was holding its breath. I took the shot, the soft click of the shutter echoing louder than it should have. In the dim light of the makeshift darkroom, the photograph began to reveal its secrets. The staircase loomed in sharp detail, the banister gleaming faintly under the flash. But there they were again, the figures. This time, there were more of them. The man and woman still smiled their impossible smiles, but now they were joined by others. A boy clutching a teddy bear, an elderly woman with a veil covering half her face, and a man whose hollow eyes seemed to bore into my soul. They were all smiling, and they were all facing the camera. But the worst part wasn't their presence, it was their position. They were on the staircase, and they were looking down at me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. The smiles, too wide and too still, etched themselves into my mind. When sleep did come, it was shallow and restless, filled with whispers and flickering images of the attic. By morning, I knew I had to find out more about the camera and its connection to Margaret. Somewhere in this house there had to be answers. I returned to the attic, my heart pounding as I climbed the creaking stairs. The journal had mentioned a box of keepsakes, and I was determined to find it. After hours of searching, I unearthed a small wooden chest hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. Its brass latch was rusted, but yielded under pressure. Inside, I found a collection of faded photographs, each one more unnerving than the last. Smiling figures crowded every frame, their poses stiff and unnatural. Some were partially blurred, as if caught mid-motion, their smiles stretching wider than seemed possible. Among the photos was a letter addressed to Margaret. The handwriting was spidery and uneven, the ink faded with age. "Dearest Margaret, you must destroy it. The camera is not a tool, but a trap. Each photograph feeds them, brings them closer to our world. I fear they will not stop until they have crossed completely." The letter ended abruptly, the final words smeared into obscurity. My hands trembled as I placed it back in the box, the weight of its warning sinking in. As I stood to leave, a sudden chill swept through the attic. The air grew heavy, pressing against me like an unseen hand. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Just a shadow, just a trick of the light, I told myself. But when I turned, I saw it clearly. A figure stood in the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by shadows. Its features were indistinct, but the grin was unmistakable. Wide, toothy, and impossibly still. It raised a hand, fingers curling in a slow, deliberate wave. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the boxes, and bolted down the stairs. The attic door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the frame. For the rest of the day, I refused to go near the camera. But as evening fell, the whispers began again, faint but insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, a chorus of voices just beyond hearing. And then, from the corner of the living room, I heard the soft click of a shutter. The click of the shutter echoed unnaturally, cutting through the house's oppressive silence. I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. The camera sat where I'd left it, still aimed at the staircase. Yet now, its lens gleamed faintly in the dim light, as though catching a source of illumination I couldn't see. I approached it cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate. The air around the camera felt colder, and a faint hum seemed to vibrate in the stillness, just at the edge of hearing. My fingers trembled as I reached out to check the plate. It was already developing. Impossible. The image unfolded with unnatural speed, details blooming on the glass like ink spilling across paper. My pulse pounded in my ears as the scene came into focus. The staircase was empty, but only for a moment. As I watched, faint outlines appeared at the edges of the photograph. Shadows stretched and warped, forming the familiar figures. They stood motionless at first, their eerie smiles frozen in place. But as the image clarified, they began to shift. They moved. The man turned his head, his vacant eyes locking onto the camera. The woman's hand reached out, fingers curling as though grasping for something unseen. The boy stepped forward, his teddy bear dangling limply from his hand. I stumbled back, the photograph slipping from my grasp and shattering on the floor. The sound of the breaking glass was sharp, but it couldn't drown out the whispers that had begun to fill the room. This time they were louder. They weren't just in my head anymore, they were here. I turned, my eyes scanning the dim living room, but I saw nothing. Only the flickering shadows cast by the storm outside. Yet the whispers grew louder, surrounding me, pressing in closer with each passing second. "We see you. You open the door. It's your turn now." The last phrase sent a jolt of fear through me, cold and sharp as a blade. My gaze darted back to the camera. Its lens glinted again, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw movement reflected within it. Faint, ghostly shapes, twisting and writhing. I couldn't stay in the house, not with them. Grabbing the journal and the remaining plates, I fled to the attic, slamming the door shut behind me. The whispers followed, muffled now but no less persistent. I rifled through Margaret's notes, my hands shaking as I searched for some clue, some way to undo what I had unleashed. One passage caught my eye. "To close the door, you must break their hold. Deny them the light that binds their shadows to ours, but beware, their reach is strongest where the veil is thin." The light, the camera. I knew what I had to do. The attic was eerily still, the storm outside muffled by the thick walls. I positioned the camera in the center of the room, its lens aimed at nothing but empty air. The last plate rested in my hand, its surface cold and slick. The whispers intensified, their voices rising in a cacophony of desperation and rage. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, curling and twisting like smoke. I ignored them, focusing instead on loading the plate into the camera. "Deny them the light," I whispered to myself, repeating Margaret's words like a mantra. My hands found the camera's shutter, and with a final steadying breath, I pressed it. The flash lit up the attic, impossibly bright. For a moment the room was bathed in blinding white, every shadow banished, the whispers cut off abruptly, replaced by a ringing silence that pressed against my ears. When the light faded, the attic was empty. No shadows, no whispers, just me and the camera, its lens now dull and lifeless. I stepped closer, my movements tentative, and retrieved the plate. It felt warm in my hands, its surface smooth and unmarred. I didn't dare develop it, not yet. Instead, I placed it back in the wooden box, securing the latch with shaking fingers. The house felt different now, lighter as though a weight had been lifted. But I couldn't stay. I packed my things that night, leaving the camera behind in the attic, wrapped in a thick cloth and buried beneath layers of forgotten clutter. As I drove away, the house receded into the distance, its dark silhouette fading into the stormy night. But even as I left it behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped entirely, that somewhere, deep in the shadows, smiling faces were still watching, waiting for the next door to open.